Hey everybody, welcome to Life is Beautiful. I'm Anthony, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about black IPAs. In particular, we're going to be talking about exactly where they originated from, because this story is steeped in controversy. There are people fighting over the origin, where the first one came from. And it's almost created a weird divide, and it's brought up a lot of questions about where beer originates from and who is able to claim ownership of a beer style, and really what is the definition of a beer style and what makes that criteria fit particular beers. So it's a bit of a mess and it's a bit long, but let's get into it. Now, before we get into the convoluted history of where black IPAs came from, let's talk a little bit about what exactly a black IPA is. Well, essentially, a black IPA is exactly what it sounds like. It's an IPA that's black. It is a little bit of an oxymoron because, the P part of IPA is pale, so you don't really think pale when you're looking at a beer that looks like this. So kind of right off the bat, we can see how much of a misfit it is. The black IPA has all the hop characteristics in the nose and on the taste that you would expect to find in an IPA, but it also has the appearance and a lot of the same malty, sweet, and roasty characteristics of a darker beer like a stout or a porter. And in a way, it's almost like a perfect fusion of the two. In fact, it's even almost brewed as if you were trying to brew a stout and an IPA at the same time in the same kettle. There's usually an abundance of piney or citrusy, fruity American hops, but you're also getting all the sweet and roasty characteristics of a stout. That makes the black IPA as unique and as different in its own category as much as it does fall into the preset columns of stouts and IPAs. So into the history. The black IPA really started gaining traction around 2009, right at the cusp of the craft beer boom. People at this time were really obsessed with bitter beers. They were trying to get the most palate-wrecking, highest IBU bitterness they could find in a beer. And the two most popular styles that I remember at that time were IPAs and their variants, double IPAs, triple IPAs, and Russian Imperial Stouts. However, where those two beers kind of came out and everyone really adopted them and fell in love with them, the black IPA was a bit of a black sheep. It was both loved and hated, and there was a lot of discussion. People felt very passionately either for or against it. And one of the main arguments I heard was that it was not a black IPA at all. It was more just a hoppy American porter or a hoppy American stout. And the actual brewers who were producing black IPAs weren't really doing a whole lot of favors in that debate. One of the most prominent examples of this, and actually one of the first black IPAs to ever be packaged and distributed, was coming out of Avery Brewing Company with their New World Porter. Originally released in 1997, New World Porter was exactly what it was. It was an American modern take on the porter. It included a ton of American hops, so you got a lot of those Cascadian type flavors out of it, and people were really receptive to it as a porter. But it was probably also classified as a porter because the distinction of black IPA just hadn't really come into prominence yet. But this changed in the 2000s when New World Porter started advertising on their label that it was a black IPA. It was in very tiny font and in an obscure part of the bottle, but it was there. It was classified black IPA, but named New World Porter. Kind of confusing. Definitely blurred those lines and didn't really help anybody who was trying to choose a side. It didn't really enforce their arguments in either way. It was almost as if this new black IPA nomenclature was a bit of an afterthought. Now, the craft beer boom definitely took the black IPA and pushed it into the forefront of people's minds, especially the American craft beer drinker who was really excited to get in and experiment with all the new beer styles that were coming out and blah, blah, blah. But the black IPA is actually significantly older. Most sources today attribute the first black IPA to a particularly dark and a particularly hoppy ale known as Black Watch. The Black Watch ale was first produced by legendary brewer Greg Noonan and his assistant brewer Glenn Walter. And they produced this beer at the equally famous Vermont Pub and Brewery all the way back in 1994. That's old. The interesting thing about Black Watch was it was originally intended to be a black IPA. The assistant brewer, Glenn Walter, what he really wanted to do was he wanted to take the classic Buffalo Bills Alimony Ale and he wanted to pay an homage to it, almost a clone. And he wanted to brew a beer that represented his feelings in regards to his recent divorce that he had been going through and struggling with. So he wanted to brew something that was dark and bitter. and I would say depressing. So it was originally intended to be an IPA. Blackwatch altered the alimony ale by adding a lot of dark malt to the beer and a quote-unquote aggressive amount of Cascade hops. Blackwatch was hugely successful. It actually became a reoccurring beer and one of the most successful beers to be brewed in Vermont at that time. It was constantly on tap and all the locals loved it. And it all started because one guy was a little bit dark and bitter about his failed marriage and created the Black IPA. Now, as I mentioned, the Black IPA is a little bit derisive. It causes a lot of consternation, a lot of confusion, and a lot of debate. Like almost every other aspect of the Black IPA, not even its origin story could be clear. That has to be a point of debate as well. Black IPAs are sometimes referred to as Cascadian dark ales, and this is more prominent on the West Coast, but I've heard it referred to this throughout the United States. The reason they're called Cascadian dark ales is because the majority of the hops that are usually put into Black IPAs come from the Cascadian region of the United States, which includes like Washington, Oregon, I think parts of California, that upper Pacific Northwest area. And because that's where all the hops originate from, there are some people who do believe that Cascadian region, this Cascadian hop growers, they are actually the originators of the Black IPA because the hops come from there. It's a bit of a confusing argument that I don't really see a whole lot of merit to, but it's out there. Additionally, to kind of reinforce that weak argument, the first Black IPAs that were packaged, when released and distributed, were mostly coming out of the West Coast. You had your Stone, you had your Rogue Brewing, and honestly, the majority of people's first Black IPAs did come from the West Coast. And it's for those two reasons, which I don't think are honestly great arguments, but it's for those reasons that a lot of West Coast Cascadian, Pacific Northwestern beer brewers and connoisseurs do kind of give credit to the Cascadian Dark Ale and ownership of the Black IPA's originating point to the West Coast. Now, for me, it is absolutely an undeniable fact that the first Black IPA on record came from Vermont. And that's because the Vermont Pub and Brewery kept meticulous records and even included the origination of the Black IPA, the Blackwatch IPA. You can still find those logs online. The problem is the West Coast's distributed examples were so successful that it completely eclipsed everything that was happening in Vermont. And because of that, a lot of people never, ever heard about Vermont being the birthplace of Black IPAs, and it was almost completely lost to time. I mean, you have to do some pretty significant research for Vermont as the originating point of Black IPAs. I mean, most people are going to talk about the West Coast when they talk about Black IPAs. That's just kind of what it is in the craft beer scene nowadays. Anyways, the name debate kind of raged on in tap rooms and across bottle shares for the next couple of years. The BJCP finally took an official stance on the name and the description and the definitive characteristics of what a Black IPA is. And they characterized the Black IPA's official description under the IPA specialty subcategory 21B Specialty IPA Black IPA. Additionally, the BJCP even officially accredited Mr. Noonan as the founder in its history portion, so I mean, that was awesome for beer lovers, and it did throw a little shade at the Cascadian Dark Ale claimers. As happy as I am that this has been more or less settled, I do kind of see why people are frustrated with the name Black IPA. However, there is one last possible origin story that could give a little bit more credit to the term IPA when you're talking about the Black IPA. Throughout the 19th century, Burton, England had become known as being one of the most prominent IPA brewers in the world. They were incredibly efficient at brewing strong, hoppy, pale beers that were exceptionally well traveled and held up extremely well during these long voyages overseas. And a very interesting brewer's manuscript that was written in 1888 in Burton, England, describes a very, very interesting beer that is both dark and hoppy. This beer was described as merely a black pale ale. The full passage reads, "To begin with, then it is not customary to employ saline waters, or in other words, if such water be employed, The black beer produced is deficient in that roundness and fullness of palate taste that is considered so necessary a feature. While I can example this by referring to the black beer that is produced at Burton, which has been universally described as a mere black pale ale. Although black in color, its palate taste reminds one very strongly of the pale beers produced by Burton firms. I don't know about y'all, but that kind of sounds like a black IPA to me. But I've seen some people try to argue that that was more or less a description for porters or stouts that were being exported out, which at that time, to be fair, did usually include a higher amount of hops than the draft beers that they would have been serving in pubs and in cask ales and stuff around mainland England. However, the passage goes on to say, but at the same time it differs very widely from the accepted standard quality of black beer as specified. So to me, that sounds like they're actually describing a beer that, although black, is completely different than the traditional black beers that were brewed in that region. And when you combine that with the above passage talking about the amount of hops and its similarity in both taste and mouthfeel to that of the IPAs that were being produced in Burton, it sounds to me like some of the brewers around that time and around that area, around that region, were kind of getting experimental and playing around with IPAs, and they ended up creating a black IPA during that process. And even if the brewery didn't specifically market it or describe it as a black IPA, it seems to be that the drinkers and the people who were describing it and writing it and documenting it, they all kind of referred to it or closely associated it to IPAs instead of stouts and porters. I mean, that's pretty convincing. And it's that point that kind of makes this whole story of the black IPA so funny and so ironic to me. West Coast versus East Coast. Everyone's fighting over which is the true home place and who is the true parent and originator and who was the hometown of this uniquely American style, when it actually wasn't American at all. Just like almost every other craft beer style that we now have adopted and love so much, it started over in Europe. So that's pretty funny. So with that being said, hopefully we can finally put this whole argument to bed. I do still think there is room to argue whether Cascadian dark ales should be their own classification, but honestly, that's for another day. This video has gone on too long. So thank you very much for watching, everybody. I really hope you enjoyed, and I hope you learned a little something about one of my favorite beer styles of all time. Let me know what you thought about it, and let me know what your favorite black IPAs are, because I could talk about them all day long. Like, comment, subscribe. Remember, there is a story in every bottle, and that life is beautiful. Cheers, y'all.